On 14th of March, 1895, in the Gould mansion on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, a 19-year-old woman stood before a long pier glass, pulling on new pearl gray kid gloves. Outside, reporters wait to describe the wedding that will make her now a French countess, as the New York Times will headline it days later. Flowers crowd the staircase, their scent mixing with beeswax and the starch of fresh linens. Servants move silently over thick carpets that muffle footsteps and whispers alike. Archbishop Corrigan is already in the drawing room, where the ceremony will take place before the family's own altar. A maid smooths Anna's train while a brother straightens her veil. The gloves are tight. She flexes her fingers, learning how to move inside their constraint. The society columns have commented more on her fortune than her face. They will soon report that she is relieving New York by finally choosing a husband of sufficient rank. Anna lowers her hand, gloved and perfectly composed. The marriage, like the gloves, fits the role more than the woman. On a June afternoon in 1885, 10-year-old Anna Gould walks the terrace at Lyndhurst, the Gothic revival castle her father Jay Gould purchased in 1880 as a country refuge from the pressures of New York. The Hudson River below is veiled in summer haze, its surface catching the late light in long silver streaks. Inside the house, walnut bookcases rise 2 stories high, and stained glass windows filter colored light across marble floors, all proclaiming the reach of railroad money transformed into domestic grandeur. Jay Gould, one of the most controversial financiers of the Gilded Age, made his fortune through railroad speculation and consolidation, acquiring the Union Pacific and other lines through methods his critics called ruthless and his defenders pragmatic. By the time Anna is born in 1875, the Gould name carries weight that is financial rather than social. Millions in assets, but a reputation tarnished by accusations of market manipulation and labor disputes. Family photographs from the 1880s preserved in archives and estate collections show the youngest Gould daughter in simple white dresses beside more imposing siblings, George, the eldest son being groomed to manage the fortune, Helen, already moving in society circles, Howard and Frank, still boys learning their eventual roles. Anna appears small, often at the edge of group portraits, her hands already crossed neatly in her lap or holding a book more as symbol than occupation. Estate account books from Lyndhurst, now held in historical collections, list expenditures for private tutors, music teachers, and French lessons, the standard apparatus for educating daughters of new American fortunes in an era when girls of her class rarely attended formal schools beyond elementary years. The curriculum emphasized accomplishments: piano, drawing, languages, needlework, and the subtle arts of conversation and deportment that would prepare her for presentation in society. Anna is taught early that posture, silence, and well-timed deference are part of the inheritance, as tangible as the trust funds already being established in the children's names. In drawing room photographs from the period, her hands are often already gloved, even indoors, a marker of formality, of readiness for public appearance, of the careful construction of a proper young lady from the raw material of a child. The house itself serves as architecture of expectation. Stone walls outside, landscaped gardens stretching to the river's edge, and inside, a labyrinth of rooms where each space has its designated purpose, and each person their prescribed role. The servants' quarters are separate, their routines invisible. The children's wing is supervised. The formal rooms await occasions when the family can demonstrate that railroad money has purchased not just objects, but cultivation. Refinement here is not spontaneous, but engineered, a deliberate project of transformation in which Anna's childhood becomes a long preparation for a future she has not chosen, but which has already, in certain crucial ways, chosen her. By the time her father dies in December 1892, when she is 17, the fortune that will eventually finance a French palace and a decade of extravagant parties is already quietly assigned to trusts in her name, managed by executors who will watch over her inheritance, even as they prepare to release portions of it for her marriage settlement. By early February 1895, the Gould townhouse at 579 Fifth Avenue had become an object of intense journalistic attention. The New York Times Society column, World of Society, confirms what rumors have carried through Manhattan drawing rooms all winter. Miss Anna Gould is engaged to Count Boniface de Castellan, heir to one of France's oldest aristocratic families, a man whose ancestry stretches back to medieval Provence and whose title carries the weight of centuries. The Times column notes with barely concealed editorial opinion that the public, if not society, breathed a sigh of relief at the definitive news. Relief that this particular dollar princess has found a suitably ancient name to attach to her modern fortune. The language reveals much about the social anxieties of the era. New money-seeking legitimacy through old titles, American wealth flowing across the Atlantic to shore up European estates whose agricultural revenues have declined precipitously in recent decades. Behind the printed announcement lies a scaffold of legal documentation, drafts of marriage settlements, negotiations over dowry and control of funds, discussions between American lawyers and French aristocratic families familiar with the delicate choreography of transatlantic alliances. The size of Anna's dowry is reported in various journals as approximately $15 million, though exact figures remain somewhat obscure, partly through deliberate discretion, partly through the complexity of how Gould family trusts were structured after Jay Gould's death. In the family morning room on a February day, Anna's older sister Helen reads the engagement notice aloud from the unfolded newspaper, her voice carrying across the space to where Anna sits by a window overlooking the avenue. On a nearby chair, Anna's gloves lie neatly beside a silver letter opener and a growing stack of correspondence. Congratulations from relatives, inquiries from acquaintances, and the inevitable thank you notes that must be written in her own hand, each one a small performance of gratitude and grace. The match has been arranged, though the word arranged would never appear in polite conversation. Instead, society speaks of introductions, facilitated by mutual friends, of interests that happen to align, of affection that developed through properly chaperoned encounters in Paris and New York. Anna met Boniface, called Boney by friends and family, during a trip to Paris in 1894, introduced through social networks that connected wealthy Americans with European aristocracy in need of capital infusions. Contemporary accounts and later biographies describe Boney as charming, elegant, supremely confident in his taste and style. Photographs show a handsome man with a carefully groomed mustache, impeccable clothes, the bearing of someone who has never doubted his place in the world's hierarchies. He is 28 to Anna's 19, already known in Parisian society as a connoisseur of art and a devotee of luxury. Society's language about the match is unsubtle once decoded. Wealth is not yet complete, not yet truly respectable, until it is translated into a title. American money needs European legitimacy. European titles need American liquidity. The transaction benefits both parties, or so the theory goes, though the historical record will eventually complicate this tidy narrative. Within weeks of the engagement announcement, the same newspapers that praised the match will print more theatrical captions following the wedding. Now a French countess, as if the transformation of Anna Gould into the Comtesse de Castellan represents not just a marriage, but a successful alchemical conversion of dollars into nobility. On 5th of March 1895, detailed accounts of the wedding appeared in newspapers across the country. The ceremony takes place at the Gould Mansion, performed by Archbishop Corrigan of New York with civil confirmation by Justice Andrews, following the requirements for a marriage that will be recognized in both American and French law. The Times reports that the rooms are lavishly decorated with flowers, roses, orchids, and exotic blooms that fill the house with fragrance and transform the domestic space into a stage for this particular social drama. The headline in the next day's paper fixes Anna's new identity with declarative certainty, now a French countess. The transformation is complete, at least in the eyes of society journalism. Miss Anna Gould, daughter of a controversial railroad magnate, has become the Comtesse de Castellan, connected by marriage to families that include nobles, churchmen, and military officers stretching back through French history. This is not an isolated romance, but part of a documented pattern that historians now analyze as a significant social and economic phenomenon of the late 19th century. Anna is grouped among the dollar princesses, the term itself revealing in its mixture of American currency and European aristocratic titles wealthy young women whose substantial dowries shored up indebted European estates in the decades between 1870 and 1914. The mechanics were straightforward, even if the emotional realities were complex. European aristocratic families, hampered by primogeniture laws that kept estates intact but concentrated in eldest sons, faced declining agricultural revenues as American and Russian grain flooded European markets. Cash was needed for maintenance, modernization, and continued social prominence. Meanwhile, American industrial and financial fortunes sought the social prestige and access to court circles that European titles could provide. The market in transatlantic marriages became brisk. Historians estimate that hundreds of such marriages occurred during this period, with American fortunes, built on railroads, steel, banking, and commodities, flowing across the Atlantic to restore crumbling chateaux, settle debts, and maintain the appearances required by aristocratic life. The women who carried this capital became, in effect, unofficial ambassadors and financial instruments, their personal lives subsumed into larger patterns of international exchange. In the surviving wedding photographs, carefully posed in the Gould drawing room, Anna's gloved hand rests lightly on Boney's arm. She is dressed in white satin, her veil held in place by orange blossoms, her expression composed and unreadable. He stands beside her in formal attire, his posture suggesting confidence bordering on proprietorship. The image presents perfect symmetry. He supplies lineage, charm, and entree into exclusive European circles. She supplies liquidity, American energy, and the funds to support an aristocratic lifestyle he considers his birthright. The narrator might observe, gently, that the wedding photograph and the marriage settlement documents tell slightly different stories, or rather, that they tell the same story from different angles. One emphasizes romance and tradition. The other specifies in legal language exactly how many millions of dollars will transfer from American trusts into French accounts, and under what conditions. After a brief reception at which toasts praise the union and guests consume champagne and elaborate pastries, the couple depart for what the newspapers describe as a quiet trip to Lyndhurst before sailing to France. As they leave Manhattan, society columns enumerate Anna's trousseau: trunks of gowns from Worth and other Parisian couturiers, linens monogrammed with her new title, jewels both inherited and newly purchased for her role as a French countess. The list is exhaustive, cataloging her possessions down to the number of gloves packed for different occasions. What the columns do not list, what cannot be inventoried, are her expectations, her private thoughts about the future, her understanding of what she has gained and what she might have surrendered in this exchange. The archive preserves her trunks, but not her terms. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, the structure of Anna's girlhood education can be reconstructed from surviving records, family correspondence, and the documented patterns typical of wealthy American families in this period. Formal schooling in the conventional sense was limited. Instead, Anna's education took place primarily at home, overseen by private tutors and governesses engaged specifically for the Gould children. Account books from Lyndhurst, preserved in estate records, show regular payments to music masters, language tutors, and drawing instructors, the standard curriculum for young women of her class. Unlike her brothers, who attended preparatory schools and universities, Anna's education aimed not toward professional or academic achievement, but toward the cultivation of accomplishments that would display her family's refinement and her own marriageability. Contemporary etiquette manuals and finishing school prospectuses from the 1880s and 1890s, held in various historical collections, revealed the precise expectations for young women like Anna. Curriculum included French conversation, essential for presentation abroad, piano and possibly voice for entertaining, drawing and watercolor, acceptable artistic pursuits, and extensive instruction in deportment: how to sit without slouching, how to walk with books balanced on the head, how to enter a room, how to accept an introduction, how to manage the complex rituals of calling cards and social visits. These skills were not optional decorations, but essential tools. A young woman of Anna's wealth and aspirations would be judged first on her accomplishments, her ability to navigate social situations with grace, her capacity to serve as hostess without visible strain. Intelligence was acceptable if discreetly deployed. Education was praised if it enhanced rather than overshadowed feminine charm. At the polished rosewood piano in Lyndhurst's drawing room, a room with windows overlooking the river and walls hung with paintings purchased to demonstrate cultural sophistication, Anna practices scales while a governess sits nearby, counting time softly and correcting posture. The metronome on top of the piano ticks steadily. On a side table, arranged as if waiting for the next occasion, a pair of white gloves rest beside a calling card case and a small book of etiquette. The scene could be duplicated in dozens of wealthy households across New York, Newport, Boston, and Philadelphia. The instruction is remarkably standardized. Girls learning to perform a specific version of upper-class femininity, being shaped into potential brides whose value lies not in what they know or what they might accomplish independently, but in how they reflect credit on their families and eventual husbands. European travel supplemented this domestic education. The Gould family made trips abroad, exposing the children to museums, cathedrals, and the social customs of countries where American money was welcomed, but American manners required refinement. Anna would have visited Paris, London, perhaps Rome, and Venice, each city offering lessons in art, architecture, and the subtle differences between American and European social expectations. These trips were educational but also strategic, introducing American heiresses to potential European suitors in settings designed to impress both sides. Hotels like the Hôtel du Rhin in Paris or Claridge's in London served as temporary salons where families could meet, assess compatibility, and begin the delicate negotiations that might lead to marriage alliances. Letters among wealthy American families from this period, preserved in various archives, discuss their daughters' education with remarkable frankness, which tutors are most effective, which skills are most important, how to balance accomplishment with modesty, when to introduce daughters into society and through which networks. The language is both tender and instrumental. These are beloved children but also valuable assets whose successful placement requires careful management. It was called education. But education in this context often meant something closer to training, the systematic cultivation of specific behaviors, specific presentations of self, specific ways of moving through social spaces that would signal respectability, desirability, and successful assimilation of class expectations. Anna learns to play Chopin adequately, to converse in French without an American accent, to arrange flowers according to aesthetic principles, to write thank you notes in perfect copperplate script. What she learns less thoroughly, or perhaps not at all, is how to imagine alternatives to the life being constructed around her. By 1894, family accounts and later biographical sources place Anna in Paris, staying in rented accommodations, or with family friends who maintained establishments in the French capital during the social season. One Italian biographical entry, citing earlier sources, notes that she met Boniface de Castellane that year through Fanny Reed, described as a friend of the Gould family who moved in both American and French aristocratic circles. Paris in the 1890s, La Belle Époque, offered American visitors more than museums and boulevards. It provided a sophisticated social classroom where transatlantic marriages were negotiated through elaborate rituals of introduction, observation, and assessment. The city's salons, opera houses, and fashionable restaurants served as stages where European nobility and American wealth could encounter each other in settings that emphasized elegance and possibility. For Anna, then 18 or 19, Paris represented both liberation and scrutiny. Away from New York's more rigid social hierarchies, where the Gould name carried the taint of new money and business controversy, she could present herself as simply a wealthy young American, her substantial fortune more interesting than her father's reputation. European aristocrats, many of them in genuine financial need, were willing to overlook the source of American money if the amount was sufficient. Imagine, based on documented accounts of similar encounters, a salon in the 7th arrondissement on a spring evening in 1894, polished parquet floors gleaming under gas and early electric light, Louis XV furniture arranged to encourage conversation, the sound of French and English mixing in the air. Bony de Castellan, already a minor celebrity in Parisian society for his exquisite taste and confident style, moves through the room with the assurance of someone who has never questioned his right to be admired. When Anna is introduced to him, probably through Fanny Reed's careful orchestration, etiquette requires immediate decisions rendered through gesture rather than words. Does she keep her gloves on, signaling formality and reserve? Does she remove one glove when shaking hands, suggesting warmer interest? Does she meet his eyes directly, in the more American manner, or lower her gaze slightly, as French convention might prefer? These minute calibrations of fabric, gesture, and glance constitute a language as complex and consequential as any spoken conversation. Contemporary etiquette manuals devoted entire chapters to glove protocols: when to wear them, when to remove them, what different materials and colors signaled about status and occasion. A choice made at the wrist could communicate modesty, availability, sophistication, or naivete, often all without a word being spoken. Bonny, for his part, sees in Anna not just a young woman but a solution to his family's declining fortunes. The Castellane estates in Provence are beautiful but expensive to maintain. His own income is insufficient for the lifestyle he considers appropriate to his rank. An American heiress represents possibility: money to restore properties, fund a Parisian establishment, collect art, and live in the manner his ancestors once enjoyed before agricultural revenues collapsed. Over subsequent months, their encounters multiply: at the opera, at dinner parties, during carefully chaperoned walks in the Bois de Boulogne. Anna's mother and siblings observe, assess, investigate the Castellane family's credentials and financial situation. Boney's relatives similarly evaluate the Gould fortune, determining whether Anna's dowry is sufficient to justify an alliance with a family whose American origins are decidedly commercial. The courtship, if it can be called that, proceeds through channels more financial than romantic. Letters are exchanged, but also telegrams between lawyers. Compliments are offered, but also questions about trust structures and annual income. Society journalists begin noting the couple's public appearances together, speculation building about an engagement that seems increasingly inevitable. Within a year of that first introduction in a Parisian salon, New York newspapers will be calculating the exchange rate between Anna's dollars and Boney's name, reducing a courtship to its economic fundamentals while simultaneously praising the romance of a transatlantic love story. The contradiction, transaction and romance, calculation and emotion defines the dollar princess phenomenon, and Anna's experience of it remains largely unrecorded except through the documented facts of settlement, engagement, and marriage. The gloves she wore that first evening, if they could speak, might tell a different story than the society columns. But gloves, like most artifacts of women's constrained elegance, survive only as objects, preserved, catalogued, displayed behind glass in museums, while the experiences they enclosed remain silent. By late 1895, following their March wedding and Atlantic crossing, the newlywed Count and Countess de Castellane are installed in Paris at an Hôtel Particulier on Avenue Bosquet in the elegant 7th arrondissement, near the Invalides and the Diplomatic Quarter. Parisian residence lists and later historical accounts place Boney at 9 Avenue Bosquet between 1895 and 1902, during the early years of a marriage that will become increasingly defined by extravagance and eventual collapse. The apartment, while spacious and well located, is merely a starting point for Boney's ambitions. He immediately begins acquiring furniture, paintings, and decorative objects, using Anna's fortune to furnish their home in the style he considers appropriate: 18th century pieces, Sèvres porcelain, Brussels tapestries, mirrors, and chandeliers that catch and multiply light in the approved aristocratic manner. The Times reports in January 1897 that a son is born to the Countess de Castellane at their Paris residence, marking the arrival of an heir and confirming the dynastic dimension of their alliance. The child, named Boniface like his father, is the first of three sons Anna will bear, each birth duly reported in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic as evidence that the marriage serves its fundamental purpose of continuing the Castellane line. Society columns from this period track Anna's emergence into Parisian aristocratic life. Calls paid and received, church attendance at fashionable parishes, dinners hosted in patterns dictated by Faubourg Saint-Germain custom. She is learning, under Boney's instruction and the observation of his relatives, how to navigate a social world more rigid and formal than even New York at its most exclusive. Inside the Bosquet drawing room, calling cards accumulate on silver trays each afternoon, small pieces of engraved cardstock that carry elaborate messages through their presence, absence, or the corners turned down to signal different types of visits. Anna learns the choreography, which cards to return personally, which to answer with her own card, which invitations to accept, how long to stay at each social obligation, how to withdraw from a conversation gracefully when time or precedent requires. She practices the minute gestures that distinguish a French countess from an American heiress, how to remove one glove but not the other when taking tea, signaling both propriety and a willingness to be more intimate with one's hostess, how to hold a fan so it communicates interest or dismissal without words, how to modulate her voice to the French preference for quiet elegance over American animation. The education that began at Lyndhurst with piano scales and French grammar continues now in more sophisticated forms. Paris demands not just competence but style, not just wealth but taste, not just presence, but the appearance of belonging in circles that have historically excluded outsiders. Anna must transform herself from visiting American to resident countess, a process that requires daily attention to detail and constant performance. Photographs from these early Parisian years show Anna in increasingly elaborate gowns, her hair styled according to French fashion, her jewelry substantial but never excessive, walking the line between displaying the wealth that justifies her presence and avoiding the ostentation that might mark her as nouveau riche. Her gloves, matched carefully to each ensemble, function as another element of costume, part of a comprehensive presentation that must appear effortless even as it requires meticulous planning. Boney, meanwhile, is occupied with his growing art collection and his expanding vision of the life they should lead. He entertains frequently, his dinners becoming known for their elegance and expense. He orders new clothes from the best tailors, new furnishings from the most prestigious dealers, new carriages to navigate the Paris streets in style. The bills accumulate, paid from Anna's fortune through the marriage settlement structures that give him access to substantial annual income. She has crossed the ocean, but the classroom has merely changed address and language. The lessons continue: how to be looked at, how to represent the successful fusion of American money and French aristocracy, how to embody the dollar princess ideal that justifies such marriages in the eyes of both societies. Each dinner party is an examination, each social season a performance whose audience includes not just Parisian society, but American newspapers tracking her European success. The question of whether Anna is happy, whether she feels herself becoming who she wishes to be or simply becoming what others require, cannot be answered from the surviving documents. What is recorded is her successful execution of the role. Children born, social obligations met, household managed, appearance maintained. The inner experience remains, as always, largely illegible beneath the archived surface of public performance. Around 1900, as Paris approaches the new century with a mixture of confidence and anxiety, Boney's ambitions crystallize around objects. In his memoir, How I Discovered America, published decades later, he recalls that as his wonders accumulated and his inborn flair for judging and purchasing developed, he became obsessed with the idea of forming a kind of art trust, a revealing phrase that applies American business terminology to European aesthetic collecting. Using his wife's capital and his own cultivated taste, he acquires 18th century furniture, tapestries, and paintings at a pace that astonishes even belly-poke Paris, a city already accustomed to displays of wealth and artistic connoisseurship. Dealers such as Jacques Seligman, a prominent figure in the Paris art market who specialized in facilitating sales between European aristocratic families needing cash and new collectors able to pay, steer masterpieces toward Boney, knowing he has both the money and the ambition to buy at elevated prices. Auction records, dealer correspondence, and bills preserved in various art trade archives trace a steady stream of Gould money converting into gilt consoles, Gobelins tapestries, Sèvres porcelain, old master paintings, and sculptures that fill the Avenue Bosquet residence beyond capacity. Each acquisition is justified by Boney as preserving French cultural heritage, buying back for France what impoverished aristocrats have been forced to sell, but the collection also serves his ego, his vision of himself as a latter-day Medici whose taste and wealth can restore something of ancien regime splendor to modern Republican Paris. The distinction between genuine connoisseurship and acquisitive display blurs in Boney's practice. He does have excellent taste. His selections are generally sound. He rescues important pieces from potential dispersal or export, but he also buys compulsively, treating Anna's fortune as inexhaustible, assembling a collection whose magnificence is inseparable from its expense. At receptions held among these accumulating acquisitions, Anna presides like another carefully placed object, beautiful, expensive, properly positioned to reflect light and enhance the overall composition. Guests move through rooms where every surface displays Boney's purchases: ormolu clocks, Chinese porcelains, Renaissance bronzes, Louis XV chairs arranged in perfect symmetry. The compliments flow toward the host's discernment while Anna, standing beside a marble mantelpiece or seated on a priceless bergère, receives admiration more as Mrs. de Castellane than as herself. Her gloves, matched to each gown according to complex protocols, white for the most, formal occasions, pale colors for afternoon, sometimes longer and sometimes shorter, depending on sleeve length and time of day, function as another element in the decorative scheme. She has become part of the collection, her role to enhance rather than distract from the overall aesthetic Boney is constructing. Contemporary observers noted this dynamic with varying degrees of approval or concern. Some praised Boney's cultivation and Anna's gracious hospitality. Others began to whisper that the spending was excessive, that the collection had become an obsession, that Anna's fortune was being consumed at an unsustainable rate. French and American newspapers ran occasional features on the Castellane art collection, describing individual pieces and noting the prices reportedly paid. Each article a simultaneous celebration of taste and calculation of cost. Art, in Boney's vision, is both passion and instrument, an aesthetic language that also speaks in financial terms, broadcasting wealth while claiming to serve culture. He genuinely loves beautiful objects, but he also loves what they say about his status, his sophistication, his worthiness of the fortune he has married. The collection justifies the marriage by transforming mere money into something approaching immortality. For Anna, surrounded daily by objects her wealth purchased but her husband selected, the home they are creating together must present complicated feelings. Pride, perhaps, in the beauty and importance of the collection, satisfaction that her money enables cultural preservation, but also, possibly, an uncomfortable awareness that she occupies an ambiguous position, neither quite owner nor quite owned, essential to the enterprise but largely invisible in accounts that credit Boney's taste and vision while treating her wealth as simply the means to his aesthetic ends. Art, in this context, becomes another vocabulary of constrained power. She possesses the fortune, but he possesses the knowledge and authority to direct its application. She signs checks, but he selects canvases. The gloves that cover her hands when she greets guests among Sèvres and Gobelins might as well be labeled beautiful, expensive, essential to the presentation, ultimately decorative. Within 2 years, Even the Avenue Bosque residence will prove inadequate to house Boney's expanding collection and ambitions. What he requires is not an apartment, but a palace, a structure monumental enough to match both his ego and his accumulating art. Anna's fortune, substantial as it is about to face its greatest test. In 1902, Boney acquires land on the Avenue du Bois, later renamed Avenue Foch, in the 16th arrondissement and commissions construction of a palace explicitly modeled on the Grand Trianon at Versailles, Louis XIV's intimate retreat, though intimate in royal terms, still meant grandeur beyond most people's imagination. The building that emerges from Boney's vision and Anna's money becomes known as the Palais. Rose, named for its pinkish marble facade that catches morning light with theatrical effect. Contemporary newspapers, travel guides, and society journals describe the finished palace in language that wavers between admiration and disbelief. The long colonnaded facade facing formal gardens designed in the French classical manner. The grand staircase rising through the interior beneath painted ceilings, reception rooms that could accommodate hundreds of guests, galleries to display the expanding art collection, and everywhere the kind of elaborate gilding, marble work, and decorative detail that announces money without any need for subtlety. The construction itself becomes a spectacle, with Parisians and visitors walking past to observe progress on what newspapers call one of the most ambitious private building projects of the Belle Époque. The costs, reported in various sources and confirmed by later accounting, run into millions of francs, millions that ultimately derive from Anna's Gould fortune, now flowing steadily across the Atlantic and into Parisian limestone and gilt. Time magazine, in a retrospective piece decades later, describes Anna's marriage to Boney as an 11-year phantasmagoria of pink marble palaces and $150,000 parties, during which the Parisian gay blade spent more than half her inheritance. The language is deliberately theatrical, but the financial substance is accurate. Between the palace construction, furnishing, art purchases, and the relentless entertaining that Boney considers essential to his position, Anna's fortune is being consumed at a rate that will prove impossible to sustain. The parties themselves become legendary. Guests recall fêtes where the Bois de Boulogne was rented for private use, paths lit with thousands of lanterns, orchestras hidden behind carefully manicured hedges to provide music that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself. One celebrated dinner required the construction of a temporary theater in the palace gardens. Another featured a complete recreation of an 18th century court gathering, with guests in period costume and musicians playing instruments authentic to the era. These events cost staggering sums. The $150,000 figure mentioned by Time would have been enough to build multiple comfortable houses or support working families for years, but for Boney, they represent necessary expenditures in the economy of prestige. To be talked about, to be remembered, to establish himself as a leading figure in Parisian society requires spectacle that exceeds what others can or will attempt. In the Palais Rose's grand ballroom, lit by electric chandeliers that represent the latest technology disguised in 18th century forms, Anna presides as hostess at these elaborate entertainments. Her gloves are no longer simple accessories, but costume pieces selected to complement specific gowns designed for specific occasions, part of a comprehensive presentation that requires teams of servants, dressmakers, and jewelers to execute. She lifts a fan, accepts hands for the next waltz, circulates among guests making small talk in French that, by now, is fluent and accent-free, and all the while performs the role of gracious countess, while the fortune that makes everything possible drains away beneath the surface spectacle. In photographs from these years, she often appears not at the center of compositions but slightly aside, present, essential, but somehow peripheral to the events her money creates. The palace transforms refinement into pure spectacle, and spectacle into a mechanism for converting capital into reputation at an unsustainable rate. Contemporary observers begin to worry, then to gossip, then to comment openly that the Castellane spending has crossed from magnificent to reckless. Articles appear questioning how long even a Gould fortune can sustain such expense. American relatives and trustees grow concerned, communicating with Anna about the financial situation and urging restraint. But Boney, intoxicated by his own success at creating a vision of aristocratic splendor, cannot or will not moderate. For him, the palace and parties are not merely displays, but essential assertions of identity, proof that he possesses not just title and taste, but the resources to live as he believes a Castellane should live. That the resources are actually Anna's seems, in his view, a technical detail rather than a fundamental constraint. The palace stands, indisputably magnificent, a monument to Belle Epoque excess and one man's aesthetic ambitions realized through one woman's inherited wealth. Whether it represents achievement or folly, art or waste, depends on perspective and what one values. What cannot be disputed is the cost, mounting steadily in account books that track a fortune's transformation into marble, parties, and memories that will outlast the marriage they were meant to adorn. By the turn of the century, the financial reality underlying the Castellane spectacle became impossible to ignore. Journalists on both sides of the Atlantic, having celebrated the marriage in 1895, now begin openly discussing numbers with a directness that would have been considered vulgar in earlier coverage. An 1899 piece in the Western Graphic lists Comtesse Bonny de Castellane, Anna Gould, among American heiresses who married European titles, noting her dowry of $15 million, a figure that makes concrete what society columns previously implied. The marriage of French and American legal structures creates complex intertwining of authority and control. Trusts established after Jay Gould's death in 1892 hold much of Anna's wealth, with American trustees, bankers, and lawyers charged with protecting the Gould heirs' interests, maintaining oversight even after her marriage. Marriage contracts and settlements negotiated in 1895 channel portions of the trust income into Boney's control, giving him substantial annual sums but not unlimited access to the principal. This structure, meant to protect Anna's inheritance while allowing her husband the resources to maintain their aristocratic lifestyle, works adequately as long as spending remains within anticipated bounds. But Boney's expenditures on the Palais Rose, art collection, and relentless entertaining push far beyond those bounds, forcing periodic negotiations between trustees, lawyers, and the couple over access to additional funds. Contemporary accounts and later biographers estimate that Boney spends approximately $10 million of Anna's fortune during their marriage, roughly two-thirds of her inheritance consumed in 11 years of sustained magnificence. The money flows from Gould family trusts in New York through international banking channels into Parisian accounts, then out again in payments to architects, builders, art dealers, florists, caterers, dressmakers, jewelers, and the small army of servants and staff required to maintain the palace and stage its entertainments. In family correspondence about estate management and litigation that emerges in later years, preserved in legal archives and historical collections, Anna reappears not as the gracious hostess of society columns, but as a claimant and plaintiff, challenging trustees over mismanaged funds and seeking greater control over her own inheritance. The gloves that once signaled deference now shield fingers that sign legal instructions, reviewing account statements, questioning expenditures, asserting rights that marriage had appeared to subordinate but which trust law and American courts continue to recognize. The financial strain produces other effects beyond legal maneuvering. Creditors who supplied goods and services for Castellane parties and palace operations began to press for payment. Some threaten legal action. Others settle for partial payment or promises of future funds. Parisian society, which had admired the couple's extravagance, began to whisper about debt, about American money running out, about whether the Castellane spectacle can continue. Anna herself, according to later accounts and the recollections of those who knew her during this period, grows increasingly aware that her fortune is not inexhaustible, that the lifestyle Boney insists upon is financially unsustainable, and that her role has been less partner than funding source. What began as marriage transforms gradually into something more complicated, a business arrangement gone wrong, a cultural collision between American expectations of partnership and European assumptions about aristocratic male prerogative, a personal relationship deteriorating under the weight of financial pressure and accumulated resentments. Money, like etiquette, operates according to rules, and there are penalties when those rules are ignored or deliberately violated. The trustees in New York, bound by their fiduciary obligations to protect the Gould inheritance, became increasingly unwilling to release additional principal to cover Boney's spending. Anna, caught between her husband's demands and her trustees' resistance, occupies an impossible position. Legally wife, practically plaintiff, nominally countess, actually creditor to her own marriage. By 1905 and 1906, the situation approached a crisis. The palace still stands, magnificent and expensive to maintain. The art collection still requires insurance and care. The staff still needs wages. The creditors still demand payment. And Anna's fortune, while still substantial, has been reduced to a point where further spending at Castellane rates would threaten her financial security and her children's inheritance. As creditors begin to murmur more loudly, and trustees in New York contemplate legal interventions to prevent further dissipation of the trust assets, the marriage that once symbolized the successful fusion of American capital and European culture is quietly reclassified as something else: a financial liability, a legal problem, a situation requiring resolution through courts rather than through the social mechanisms that created it. By 1906, the facade, both architectural and social, finally cracked under accumulated pressures. In November, the New York Times reports from Paris under the headline, "Castellane Still Seeks Reconciliation," noting that if witnesses are called in the pending divorce case, some of the highest names in France are likely to be besmirched by testimony about affairs, debts, and the private failures underlying the public spectacle. Anna has filed for civil divorce under French law, citing grounds that contemporary sources describe as Boney's persistent infidelity and ruinous financial extravagance. The legal case proceeds through French courts according to Third Republic civil procedures, a public airing of private grievances that transforms marriage into evidence and intimacy into testimony subject to cross-examination. Spanish language biographical sources, drawing on French court records and contemporary newspaper accounts, summarize the proceedings with brutal directness. After spending approximately $10 million on extravagances, palaces, parties, art, carriages, clothes, and the relentless consumption that defined their life together, the marriage ended in divorce. The Countess sought and obtained legal separation, retaining custody of their 3 sons and recovering control over the remainder of her fortune. Inside the Palais Rose during these months, the atmosphere must have been strange and terrible. Staff uncertain about their futures, children aware that something fundamental has broken, and throughout the vast rooms the accumulated objects, furniture, paintings, porcelains, the material record of Boney's taste and Anna's money, standing witness to a partnership dissolving into litigation. Court sketches from the divorce proceedings, later reproduced in French and American newspapers, show Anna seated in the courtroom, her posture rigidly correct, gloved hands folded, in her lap as lawyers argue over whose fault the breakdown represents. She is described as composed, dignified, speaking when required, but otherwise maintaining the reserve that has characterized her public appearances throughout the marriage. The phantasmagoria of pink palaces and extravagant parties has become legal evidence, transformed from social triumph into documentation of waste and misconduct. French divorce law in this period, though more liberal than in many other countries, still required specific grounds and substantial proof. Anna's case apparently met these requirements. The divorce is granted, and with it comes a settlement that restores to her control over her remaining fortune and primary custody of their 3 young sons. Boney retains his title, his art collection, and his palace, though maintaining them without Anna's continued financial support will prove increasingly difficult. The divorce scandal reverberates through both Parisian and American societies. Newspapers that once celebrated the marriage now dissect its failure, some blaming Boney's extravagance, others suggesting that Anna should have exercised more control, still others treating the whole affair as inevitable evidence that such transatlantic marriages were fundamentally flawed. The coverage is often prurient, interested more in gossip and scandal than in any genuine analysis of what the marriage reveals about wealth, gender, and the intersections of American capitalism and European aristocracy. For Anna herself, the divorce represents both catastrophe and liberation. She has lost half her fortune and endured public humiliation. Her children will grow up in a divided household. Her social position, while still elevated by wealth and title, is complicated by the stigma divorce carries in Catholic France and elite American circles. But she has also escaped a marriage that had become financially ruinous and personally intolerable, and has recovered agency over her own money and decisions that marriage had largely transferred to her husband. Divorce, in this world, is another public ritual, governed by forms as rigid as those that structured the marriage itself. Courtrooms replace drawing rooms, lawyers replace matchmakers, judges render verdicts where once families negotiated settlements. The gloves Anna wears to court appearances are probably black or dark colored, appropriate to the somber occasion, covering hands that now sign documents of separation rather than marriage contracts, ending what a decade earlier had begun with such optimism and public celebration. The case establishes certain principles that will matter for future dollar princesses. That American trust structures can provide some protection against European husbands' unlimited spending. That divorce, while difficult and socially costly, is legally possible. That women are not entirely without recourse when marriages fail. These are small victories in a system still heavily weighted toward male authority, but they matter. When the decree is finally granted, Anna keeps her fortune, or what remains of it, and her children. What she cannot keep, and perhaps cannot recover, is the illusion that marriage between American wealth and European title represents fairy tale resolution rather than complex negotiation with winners, losers, and costs distributed unequally between parties who entered the arrangement with vastly different expectations and powers. The legal drama does not end with civil divorce in French courts. Seeking to remarry within the Catholic Church and determined to erase the marriage that has become such a public failure, Boney petitions the Vatican for an annulment, a declaration that the marriage was never valid from its beginning, despite a decade together and 3 children who stand as living evidence to the contrary. The case winds through the complex structures of Catholic canon law, heard first by the Roman Rota, the Vatican's appeals court for marriage cases, and then by the Apostolic Signatura, the supreme tribunal of the Catholic Church. The process takes years, involving theologians, canon lawyers, expert witnesses, and exhaustive examination of the circumstances surrounding the 1895 marriage ceremony. Initial decisions in 1911 apparently support Boney's petition, finding grounds for annulment based on arguments that scholars of canon law might recognize as technical rather than substantive, perhaps questions about consent, about whether the marriage was entered into with proper understanding and intention, about whether all canonical requirements were fully met. Time magazine's 1924 summary, published under the headline Marriage Annulled, condenses years of complex legal argument into a few stark lines, confirming that the Vatican has ruled the Castellane marriage void. The later timeline, various sources place final rulings in the 1920s, reflects the slow, deliberate pace of Vatican jurisprudence, especially in cases involving prominent families and substantial publicity. Each stage requires review. Each argument demands response. Each precedent must be weighed against theological principles governing the sacrament of marriage. There are no surviving images of Anna in Vatican chambers, no photographs of her testimony or evidence presentation. Much of the record is in procedural Latin, the universal language of Catholic canon law, creating documents whose style and format have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. But the human reality beneath the legal formality is clear. A private relationship, already ended in civil courts, is being dissected, analyzed, and ultimately declared non-existent by religious authority located thousands of miles from where the marriage was performed and lived. For Anna, The annulment must represent a peculiar sort of insult added to injury. The civil divorce at least acknowledged that the marriage existed before ruling it dissolved. The Catholic annulment suggests that the entire experience, 11 years, 3 children, half her fortune spent, never constituted a valid sacramental union. Her decade as Comtesse de Castellane is retroactively erased from canonical record as if it were a prolonged misunderstanding rather than the defining experience of her young adulthood. The children complicate this theological abstraction. Canon law provides that children of annulled marriages are not illegitimate. They were born in good faith to parents who believed themselves married, but the logic remains troubling. How can a marriage that produced 3 sons be declared never to have existed? The law answers with distinctions between civil status and sacramental validity, between legal fact and spiritual truth, but such distinctions may offer little comfort to those whose lived reality is being reclassified. The gloves from the 1895 wedding, if they still exist somewhere in storage or museum collections, are absent from these Vatican proceedings. They have been replaced by different artifacts, notarized documents, ecclesiastical seals, stamped decrees in Latin declaring that what everyone witnessed in the Gould mansion on Fifth Avenue was not, in the eyes of the Church, actually a sacramental marriage. Boney's motivations for seeking annulment are transparent. Free to remarry in the Church, he can pursue another wealthy Catholic wife without the impediment of being a divorcee, a status that would complicate future alliances. The annulment serves his interests by clearing his record, transforming him from a man who failed at marriage into a man whose apparent marriage was, technically, never valid. For Anna, by 1924, the annulment likely matters less. She has already remarried civilly, found different arrangements for her life and children, moved beyond the Castellane years, even as their financial and emotional consequences continue. Whether Rome declares her first marriage valid or void is largely symbolic, a judgment that may sting but changes nothing about her current circumstances or her understanding of what she lived through. What the annulment does accomplish is a certain historical confusion. Future accounts will sometimes describe Anna as having one marriage or two, depending on whether civil divorce or canonical annulment is being referenced. The legal and spiritual timelines diverge, creating parallel versions of her life story that never quite align. While Rome debates the validity of her past through theological lenses and canonical procedures, Anna is already constructing a different future under another name, married to another aristocrat, navigating similar social waters with experience that her first marriage, valid or not, undeniably provided. In 1908, after her civil divorce but before the Vatican annulment is finalized, Anna marries Élie de Talleyrand-Périgord, Prince de Sagan, and later 5th Duke of Talleyrand, a cousin of Boney and a descendant of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, the legendary French statesman whose name had long symbolized calculated diplomacy, strategic marriage, and the navigation of political change through personal adaptation. The connection to Boney, Élie is his cousin, adds a layer of complexity to the marriage that contemporary observers find either scandalous or grimly practical. Newspaper features such as The Family in Which Anna Gould Married, published in American papers, map the extensive Talleyrand lineage, 3 dukedoms, 1 Prussian principality, and already several previous American brides absorbed into the family tree through similar transatlantic marriages. The pattern of cash and coronets repeats, but Anna approaches her second marriage with vastly different experience and expectations. She is no longer a 19-year-old heiress being presented into European society, but a divorced mother in her early 30s, a public figure familiar with both admiration and pity, a woman who has learned that marriage contracts matter as much as romance, and that control over one's fortune requires constant vigilance rather than trusting delegation. Contemporary accounts suggest that Anna and Élie's marriage is more partnership than the first, based on mutual respect, shared interests in art and society, and perhaps a more realistic understanding of what such unions actually entail. Élie, unlike Boney, does not seem driven to spectacular display or ruinous extravagance. Their life together is reportedly more restrained, more focused on family and the management of properties than on relentless entertaining. Photographs from this period show a more reserved figure than the young Countess of the Palais Rose years. Anna appears in darker gowns, simpler settings, often photographed at country estates rather than in elaborate ballrooms. Her expression is harder to read. Neither the wide eyed uncertainty of her first wedding photos nor any obvious happiness, but rather a kind of composed maturity, the face of someone who has learned to expect less and protect more. Her gloves are still present in these photographs, still carefully matched to her outfits, but now more often in daytime portraits, paired with walking suits and simpler jewelry, rather than the ball gowns and tiaras that characterize the Belle Epoque extravagance. The gloves signal continuity. She remains a duchess, maintains social position, observes aristocratic formalities, but they also mark a shift from spectacle to something more sustainable. Refinement remains central to Anna's presentation, but its purpose has shifted from dazzling display to quiet dignity, from proving herself worthy of European nobility to simply maintaining a position she has long since earned through experience, if not initially through birth. She knows now what her first marriage taught her, that beauty and grace are not protection, that performance does not guarantee partnership, that money creates options, but not immunity from disappointment or loss. When the First World War erupts in 1914, reshaping European society and accelerating the decline of the old aristocratic order that Anna married into, her American fortune and her experience navigating between worlds serve her well. The war brings privation even to the wealthy, erosion of social hierarchies, new tax regimes that target inherited wealth and aristocratic privilege. Many great families face ruin. Many estates are sold or abandoned. Anna, with her American resources and her American pragmatism, helps ensure the Talleyrand name endures through this period of transformation. She funds necessary adaptations, supports family members in difficulty, and maintains properties that others might abandon. Her money, originally imported to rescue one aristocratic fortune, now helps preserve another, though the social world these fortunes were meant to maintain is rapidly disappearing around them. The marriage to Élie lasted until his death in 1937, providing Anna with nearly 3 decades of relative stability and partnership that contrasted sharply with her first 11 years as Countess de Castellan. What survives in the historical record suggests not passion but functionality, a marriage that worked as practical arrangement, social alliance, and perhaps even genuine companionship, if not the romantic ideal that dollar princess narratives were meant to represent. When World War and new economic realities erode the old order permanently, Anna's fortune, diminished by Boney but not destroyed, managed now with greater caution, and her adaptive capacity helped the Talleyrand family navigate transitions that swallow many of their contemporaries. The American heiress who arrived in Paris in 1895 to play Duchess has become, by the 1930s, an actual pillar of an aristocratic family whose survival depends partly on her continued support. In March 1945, Time magazine published a brief item about the Duchess de Talleyrand, Anna Gould, now 70 years old, auctioning her famous orchid collection at Lyndhurst, the Gothic revival estate on the Hudson where her childhood began. The sale benefits the Red Cross, freeing 75 tons of coal and 9 gardeners for wartime service. The article describes her as chic, spry, a longtime resident of pre-war Paris, now returned to the Hudson Valley of her youth as Europe tears itself apart for the second time in her lifetime. The orchid collection had been substantial, maintained over decades in greenhouses at Lyndhurst, reflecting Anna's interest in horticulture and perhaps also her desire for beauty she could control. Flowers that bloomed according to botanical laws rather than social expectations. The wartime auction transforms private pleasure into public contribution, a gesture both practical and symbolic of how Anna has learned to navigate between private desire and public obligation. She lives out her remaining years primarily in France, returning to a country that has been dramatically transformed by 2 world wars, occupation, and social revolution. The Belle Epoque world of her first marriage is as distant as if it belonged to another century. And in meaningful ways, it does. The Palais Rose no longer belongs to the Castelline family. The art collection has been dispersed. The social rituals that structured her youth have largely evaporated. By the time Anna dies in Paris in November 1961, at age 85, she has outlived both husbands, outlived her eldest son George, who died young, and outlived the entire world that made her a dollar princess and a French duchess. She is buried at Passy Cemetery in Paris, in a plot that places her permanently in France rather than America, marking her as ultimately more European than American, despite the Gould fortune that defined her story. Obituaries in both French and American newspapers note her long life, her marriages, her social position, and her American origins. But they are brief. She is remembered more as a figure from the past than as someone whose death matters to the present. The 1960s have little time for Gilded Age stories of heiresses and titles. The world has moved on to different concerns and different definitions of prestige. Visitors to Lyndhurst today can tour the estate, now preserved as a National Historic Landmark and operated by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Displays include Gould family possessions, photographs showing Anna as a child and young woman, monogrammed linens from the various households she managed, and fragments of the wardrobes that once moved through Parisian salons and New York drawing rooms. Her life has become an educational exhibit, material for understanding Gilded Age social history and the transatlantic marriage patterns that defined her generation. The museum displays rarely include gloves, though surely some must survive somewhere in collections or storage. But if we imagine them, a pair of pale kid gloves, perhaps the pearl gray ones from her first wedding, or the white ones from countless social appearances, they would be preserved behind glass now, fingers slightly curved as if still adjusting to an unseen hand, the leather creased where hands once moved inside them. These gloves, if we could see them, would speak of daily ritual, the morning adjustment before leaving the house, the careful removal when etiquette permitted, the matching of color and length to gown and occasion, the constant attention to detail that elegant performance required. They would speak of constraint and protection simultaneously, covering hands that signed checks and marriage contracts, that held children and lifted champagne glasses, that gestured in French conversation and wrote correspondence in multiple languages. In the mirror created by the first image and the last, the 19-year-old adjusting gray gloves before her 1895 wedding, and the octogenarian whose preserved possessions now educate visitors about a vanished world. Grace remains visible. The cost it carried is what lingers, quietly, in the space between them. Half a fortune spent. A decade of marriage ended in divorce courts and Vatican tribunals. A life lived largely in performance, and beneath it all, a person whose inner experience we can only glimpse through the artifacts she left behind. The portrait endures in museum photographs and historical accounts. Anna Gould becomes Anna de Castellane, becomes Anna de Talleyrand, each name marking a transformation, each role requiring its own costumes and gestures. But the gloves, preserved or imagined behind glass in museum collections, remain most eloquent about what cannot be fully documented. The daily experience of constrained elegance, the weight of expectation worn like second skin, the space between public presentation and private feeling that no archive can completely illuminate.